Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for tuning in. We are going to dive into, just full on dive it into it, on short term and long term emotional needs. So, as a coach, I love coaching ladies who are struggling with codependent behaviors. And as a coach, the goal is to help them see their own thinking so that they can transfer those codependent behaviors and transform them into leading lady behaviors. So, why do I speak about behaviors when we're talking about short term and long term emotional needs? Well, when we choose to do an act in our life, it is normally stemming from an emotion we have, and we are trying to meet it with a need. So when we do a behavior, we are choosing the action in that behavior to meet an emotional need. So when we are coming from a codependent type behavior, what we're trying to meet is we're actually meeting what we call the short-term emotional need. When we are showing up in the world as a leading lady and we're choosing those types of behavior, we are actually meeting a long-term emotional needs. So then the question would be, well, Angie, well, people will call me Angie, but Angela doesn't matter for me. But anyways, so they might say, well, Angela, the difference then why, if it's just that I'm going to meet a long-term emotional need, then I'll just do that to become a leading lady. And when it comes to our emotional needs, one of the things that really is kind of sneaky is we cannot quite know if it's conscious or subconscious that we're meeting this need. So we sometimes go, well, this is just a habit that I have, instead of really looking and dissecting it and figuring out what emotional need am I trying to meet from this habit that is now formed into a behavior. So that's what we want to do. We want to dive into short-term versus long-term emotional needs. Are you ready? All right, let's dive into this. So we have short-term. When you think of short-term, one of the things, a big one, is instant. We want it instant, right? So instant gratification, right away, we get it. So when talking about instant gratification, one of the things we could explore is the difference between dial-up versus the internet, right? Dial-up internet versus instant internet that most of us have now. Especially if you're viewing this, you're not on dial-up. I about guarantee it, because it would take way too long for you to view this video if you were on dial-up. And so instant, so right, we have the internet. And then also another thing to think about instant is we have on demand, right? We have on demand when it comes to TV. We can watch no commercials, go straight to what we want to watch on TV. And I have a little side note here. Have you not noticed that, right, we are bombarded with commercials and advertisements on all of our devices? But obviously on TV, we can choose if we want to watch commercials or not. So sometimes I kind of wish that we would just get the commercials, the TV, and then we wouldn't have so many advertisements that are always coming up with us on our devices. That's just a little side note, but I get it. There's good and bad in both. You know, there's not like one way that's just going to be just perfect, but it's just funny. I was thinking about that. So we have on demand. So if these are the sources we have here, we talked about what the long term was, right? So instead of instant, it's a gain over time. So we gain something over time. We don't see it right away. So when we're talking about a long-term emotional need, we don't see it right away. It's over time that we start to see that that emotional need is being met. But actually, there's a little side note. It can be met during the conversation. So when I start talking about the relationship and conversations when it comes to these emotional needs, it can actually be met during the conversation before it even starts. We're going to talk about that. But let's go back to what long-term means. So we've got the gain over the long period of time. So it's not instant. There's a gain over a long period of time, or depends on, I mean, some are longer than others. And then instead of the internet, we were just talking about it, right? Dial-up. So dial-up would be an idea of something that takes a longer time. And then on demand, we've got old school TV. I mean, if you're close to my age, you remember when we would have to literally schedule when we were going to watch our shows. We had to know when the show time was showing. And if we didn't watch it during that time, we missed it. And that means that we missed it. We'd have to wait till a rerun, which could be a long period of time from then. And so it was really important that we scheduled ahead of time before we sit down and watch TV, because now we have on demand and it's right away, and we don't have to schedule necessarily, because we can sit and we can, a good saying is we binge watching Netflix, right? So we could go into that, which is again, that short term, that instant gratification. So here's a little bit of difference between the two. So let's dive in a little bit as far as relationship. So when it comes to relationship, it's interesting because it's not that we want to fight with each other or we want to have confrontation of any kind. It's more formed, and actually I'm going to do a blog and a video on this one coming down. It's more formed based on our ego. And a lot of times it's interesting, you talk about ego and some people start thinking, well, I don't have an ego. And we actually all have an ego. It's very important that we do have an ego, because without an ego, we would never have self-worth. So sometimes, right, there's a flip coin to everything. And sometimes if we were to get rid of the ego, we'd have no self-worth. But we need to have an ego in order to have self-worth. And because we have that, sometimes we want to start proving that the way we see things and the way we view things is the right way, because our ego gets involved in it a little bit. So when you have two people that see things their way, there can be some kind of confrontation in there a little bit as well. So I want to explore here short-term emotional need. So going back to ego is the short-term emotional need, wanting to be right, wanting to prove something to somebody. Sometimes even like coming up with a lot of excuses is actually a short-term emotional need, because when we come up with excuses, we start to feel like we've got the weight off of ourselves and it's on somewhere else. And when we do that, realizing that that actually is another codependent behavior, because anytime we don't take things on ourselves and we start putting it on somebody else, that shows that we're using that relationship, and there's dependency there. Because without them, right, if you were interdependent, without that dependency, you'd have nobody else to actually show that onto. And so finding that self-responsibility, not having any excuses, coming up with questions, trying to look for resolve, those are more long-term emotional needs met within that relationships versus that short-term. So the short-term is that ego, when ego is fighting against ego. So like I said, ego is not bad. There's nothing wrong with ego. We need ego because ego gives us self-worth, and that's important. But when we come and we show up in that short term wanting to meet that need, what's happening is that we are wanting the other person to show that we're right, or to prove that we're right, or to explain ourselves, right? So even excuses could be explaining ourselves, like trying to show them our point of view. That's a huge one, right? Well, I just want them to understand the way that I see it. I want them to know my point of view. And when we're saying, I want them to know my point of view, and we're attaching that they need to answer and respond in a way that we think is the right way, then understanding that is a short-term gain that you're looking for. And when you are keep on in relationships and you're keeping on looking for that short-term emotional need, you feel like a hamster on a wheel. You start to feel overwhelmed. You start to feel anxiety. you start to create emotions in your body, and you're just going, I don't even know when to stop because I'm constantly having to prove myself, excuse myself. I'm having to show them what it is that I see so that they see it my way. And when you're doing that, you are the hamster on the wheel. So think about it. The hamster goes on the wheel because it keeps on going, because it's meeting a physical need, but also emotional, right? Because it wants to keep on moving. And that's really important for that hamster to keep on moving. And so they get on that wheel and they go, go, go. And so in a way, when we want to feel busy, important, when we want to have those emotions, we are literally meeting that emotional need. Whether we want to stop to explore that or not, that's okay. But understanding that that is the need that we are trying to meet, is that instant, on demand, right? Internet going right away, emotional need. And so this is that understanding that that's where that's coming from. When you have a relationship with people in your life, that you have loved ones and you want them just to understand you. So I want to explore what a long-term emotional need looks like. I'm going to do a little side note here, stepping back. So when we think about short-term, also think about limbic system. And I am going to do a video too about the sympathetic system. So sympathetic nervous system and the limbic system, they work hand in hand. And so when you think about that short term, the sympathetic nervous system and the limbic system, they're working together to make sure you feed that ego need, that you continue on that, what that looks like. So we're going to come over here to long term. So these are leading lady behaviors. These are ways that we show up in ways that we have self-worth for ourselves. So again, the ego, which we need, but this is the other side of the coin, the self-worth part, that we feel worthy. We feel that we are 100% worthy just the way that we are. So we show up in relationships and we plan ahead. So like example, the old school TV, we get the calendar out and we know where we're at. We maybe even doing thought downloads, which I've talked about before in a video. So doing that and getting those things out of our head and having our own back. So when we start to have discussions with other people, we show up in a way that we don't need to prove anything. And we know we don't need to prove anything. And it's not like we don't need to prove anything because we're right. We don't need to prove anything because these are my thoughts, my feelings, what I'm thinking, my back. So I'm okay. And you can start to show up for people in a way that you want to understand them. You want to hear about what they're saying, and you become that person in the room that people want to and gravitate to talk to, not because you agree with them, with everything that they say, but because you're willing to listen. And then if they ask you in return, you are willing to say what it is that how you see it with integrity. Again, we talked about that with boundaries, was one of the codependent behaviors. So poor boundaries versus a leading lady behavior, which means coming with integrity, that you know 100% of what it is that you're showing up in the world. And so when you show up in that way, you have your own back. You don't need to prove anything. You are open, you are passionate, you have more creativity, you can strategize, you can see things. And so you start showing up in a way that people actually gravitate towards you and they want what you have, because you are not trying to prove a thing, because you don't need to prove a thing. You realize that that's not what this world is about. So, and you have dial up and it's okay. You're willing to wait for the internet to happen. You plan it, ahead of time, what the long-term gain is. You see ahead of time what's coming your way, instead of looking for that short instant gratification of just that like dopamine hit, that little bit like I was right hit, versus, oh, I see how you see it. Thank you for sharing that with me. So a different sense of emotions are coming up for you when you show up in these leading lady behaviors, because you are meeting an emotional need on a scale that kind of just emulates peace. And when you have that in your life, you aren't busy trying to prove, excuse, expose. You're not trying to expose anybody else. You're open to being exposed. If people see you this way, you're open to it. You're like, oh, yeah, that's how I see it. You asked me, oh, okay, I'll be happy to share with you how I see that. And so you actually are open to that versus trying to expose other people because you're afraid of exposing yourself. You actually show up and you're like, oh, I'll expose this. Is this what you want to know? I can let you know. I mean, it's okay. And we can disagree on things, and I'm okay with that. And this is a good thing, because that means that you have your standards and your beliefs and your integrity, and I have mine. And it doesn't diminish the other. It just means that we show up in a way that we allow each other to be who they are. So when we start to develop these, there's going to be a different emotion attached to it, just like there is a different behavior outcome that happens. The emotion that generates that type of activity is going to be very different than the emotion that generates this. And as we talked about before, if you looked back at some of my older videos about how to coach yourself, about that thought process, understanding when we start to realize our thinking of what we're thinking about is generating certain emotions, we start to view things in a different way. Instead of going to the conversation saying, I need to prove myself, you go to the conversation saying, I'm here to listen and I want to understand. And you don't have to have that need of trying to prove something all the time. And it is okay if you do that. There's nothing that's gone wrong with you if you're doing that. You are being human and you're showing that your humanity is working. So your humanness is real, which means, like I said, this right here was limbic system and sympathetic nervous system, and this right here is prefrontal cortex, planning ahead of time, and parasympathetic nervous system, which is that pause, relax, digest. This is fight or flight. This is rest and digest. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I hope again this added value to you, that you found some little nuggets, some little piece of information that will give you something to ponder on and view for yourself, that you can start to view your thought process and what's coming up for you. If you are wanting to dive into and start creating more leading lady qualities in your life, if you're wanting to show up in a way that you can see it, but you're not performing it, I would love to be able to do a coach call with you and be able to explore the situation that you're experiencing. And then we can dive into that and see if we can find solutions together that will work best for you and how you are working towards showing up in your life. Thank you much for your time. Take care of you, and we'll see you next time. Bye.